Hour 2 of Exchange with Neil McKenty. Call 790-0991. That's 790-0991.
Good Monday morning again from Neil McKenty on this second hour of Exchange. What are your questions and comments this morning on the Liberal leadership race? And we welcome as our special guest on Exchange this hour the only leadership candidate from Montreal, the Honourable Don Johnson, Liberal member for St. Henri Westmount, and Minister of Science and Technology. You've just come from a meeting, Mr. Johnson, with some of the Parti Québécois, Quebec government members, Mr. Parizeau. Is there any growth in the cooperation between Quebec and Ottawa in ways of putting this province back on its commercial and economic feet?
Well, I hope so. Our message, and certainly my message during this leadership campaign, is that there's only one economy out there, and we, as elected representatives, have to put aside our squabbles and work together for the good of the people in each province. We only serve one clientele, one society. And that is the philosophy underlying these economic regional development agreements we're trying to sign with the province.
Okay, let's come to the leadership race itself. How do you respond to those observers who say you're really running to become finance minister in a new government, and when the time comes, you'll throw your support to Mr. Turner?
I'm running to win. I wouldn't win it if I didn't think we had a shot at winning. I know that currently Mr. Turner looks like a strong front runner, which is what we anticipated. There's a lot of time left until the convention. I think we're doing well, and I think we're in a strong third position, and that's where I'd like to be.
Do you agree with Mr. Turner that language services to the English in Quebec should be controlled by the Quebec government, provincial government?
My position on the language issue is pretty clear. I guess I'm the only member of the government, of the cabinet, or for that matter, I suppose, in the House that's been to the Supreme Court of Canada on the language issue within the framework of the Constitution. Now, there are certain areas of the language laws which, of course, are constitutional in nature. That's effectively what we were talking about in the Manitoba dispute, which will be referred to the Supreme Court. Now, the province has certain jurisdictions they maintain under Bill 101. There are some challenges with respect to those, and we will tell when the Supreme Court decides on areas such as signage and so on. There are divided legal views on the subject, obviously, or it wouldn't be in the court structure.
Okay, speaking of Manitoba, Mr. Johnson, how do you deal with the criticism that the federal government, especially its English Quebec members, showed far more interest in the French minority in Manitoba than they did in the English minority in Quebec?
I really don't think that's true. I don't think that's a fair criticism because the circumstances are entirely different. The decisions with respect to Quebec were made with a view to the political and the political circumstances of the day. And when we took our challenge, for example, on Bill 101, which began shortly after the Parti Québécois came into power and brought down Bill 101, we specifically asked the federal government to stay out of it because we wanted to have decisions from Quebec judges in Quebec courts, because you'll recall that Quebecers at the official level were saying the Supreme Court of Canada, it's an Anglophone Canadian court. And we wanted to make sure that we had taken that case all the way through the court system to the Supreme Court of Canada. And some people say, well, now you're talking about referring it at the federal level in the case of Manitoba. Why didn't you do that in the case of Quebec? Well, I wasn't in public life at the time, but that's the reason we didn't do it. We asked the federal government not to be involved. The federal government, in fact, came in and argued the case, intervened, as the federal government has consistently done, including very substantial financial support to people who have taken actions in the province against the provisions of Bill 101.
Okay. Do you agree with, and we'll get to the caller, 7900991, any of your comments, questions on the Liberal leadership race? Mr. Johnson could conceivably be the next Prime Minister of Canada. This is perhaps one of the only chances you will have to comment and question him directly. Mr. Johnson, do you agree with Prime Minister Trudeau's statement this weekend in Quebec City that Canada needs a stronger national government?
I've always believed that we need a strong national government, and I don't see that as being at all inconsistent with regional sensitivity. I think much of it has to do with reform of the institution itself, and I have some ideas in that regard which we could perhaps discuss this morning.
Turning to the economy, would you continue as Prime Minister to support bailouts for sick Montreal industries like Maisland?
My accent in terms of economic development is on the human resource development side. It's in the educational system. It's in training our people. It's in making individuals adaptable rather than trying to make industries adapt per se. I think that's where the accent has to be. So I think that speaks for itself. I have never been an advocate of industrial support of that kind, generally speaking. There are always specific circumstances that one has to look at. But as an overall thrust, I say support the individual, let the individual adapt.
In that same vein, how much more tax money do you think should be pumped into Canadair?
I'm not sure that question can be answered. I think if we believe the projections that are coming forward, Canadair should be breaking even on a cash basis in the very near future. That's the advice of experts at the present time, and all I can do is tell you that's what we're told, and
right.
That's a matter of public record.
Speaking of experts, you are considered, quite justly, a tax expert. Do you think the present tax system in Canada is a fair system, and is it fairly administered?
I wrote on the subject before I went into politics. My views haven't changed. I think some aspects of the system are better than when I went into politics. I think there's been some simplification, particularly with respect to the small business sector. I think many of the problems identified there remain. And obviously, we've seen examples of inconsistent administration across the country, emerging from the complaints that we're hearing from various taxpayers. So I think, obviously, there's much can be done to improve the tax structure. That's one of the principal reasons I went into public life in the first place.
All right. What do you mean by a negative income tax, and how much do you favor it at this time?
The negative income tax is a mechanism, and the real issue is, what's the purpose of the mechanism? Well, the purpose of it is to try and bring together all the various support systems, which are grafted one on top of the other, provincially and federally. The same kind of confusion that existed when the issue was addressed back in 1974. And my feeling is that we can have a better system that responds in a universal way to the needs of those most in need, and can be done with much less bureaucratic overload. And I believe that the negative income tax approach, which effectively refunds money to peoples who are at the low end of the income scale, not paying taxes, and phases them out in a systematic way, is one approach which could accomplish that. And it has to be examined in my judgment.
Could you expand very briefly your thinking on a guaranteed annual income for Canadians from 19 to 65? Here we are talking about cutting back and reducing the deficit, and we see headlines from the West or somewhere, Johnson advocates guaranteed annual income.
We're talking the same thing as the negative income tax. Effectively, we're talking about providing a form of income security for Canadians by taking existing programs, bringing them together, hopefully making them more efficient, and keeping them within the present levels. We spend about $75 billion between the two levels of government at the present time on various social security programs. Some of those should remain: universal Medicare, the old age security payments, the GIS, and so on. I'm thinking of that whole other panoply of programs which exists, which absorb something like $30 to $35 billion of taxpayers' money. I think we can design a better mousetrap to serve Canadians.
Mr. Johnson, this just came up last week in a more dramatic fashion. Do you support affirmative action for minority groups and women?
I actually put affirmative action in my department, in Treasury Board. You recall I had responsibility for those programs in the public service. And the affirmative action, of course, has to be defined. I don't believe in a quota system. I believe that barriers to progress of minority groups, women, and so on in the public service should be identified and eliminated. And that was the nature of our program. That's the one that I would hope to reinforce.
The leader of the NDP and others are concerned about conflicts this summer between an election and royal and papal visits. Can you say now that if you were Prime Minister that the visits of the Queen and the Pope would not be delayed by a summer election?
I would have to admit that I haven't spent a great deal of time thinking about that issue. The Prime Minister responded that there would be two former Prime Ministers, himself and Mr. Clark, to squire the Queen and the Pope around Canada. I suppose that's one option, but I think I think it's a little early to assess that situation.
You're the only candidate not using Air Canada passes, and one of your opponents, and indeed one of your colleagues in the cabinet, says the reason you're not using Air Canada passes, and he is because you're well-heeled and can afford to pay your own way.
I wish that were the reason. I didn't consult with any other candidates before I took the decision not to use the Air Canada pass. The Air Canada pass is there for cabinet ministers who carry on official business, obviously. And in a leadership campaign, I felt that it should not be used. It's as simple as that, and I didn't comment on the judgment of others with respect to that issue.
Okay, we have as our guest for this hour only the Honourable Donald Johnson, Liberal leadership candidate, the only one from Montreal, member for St. Henri Westmount, Minister of Science and Technology. Your comments, questions to Mr. Johnson on any aspect of policy that we've touched on or that we've forgotten to have touched on, and your questions and comments on the leadership race. As you know, Mr. Johnson could be the next Prime Minister of Canada. We will be right back with Mr. Johnson after this short break. Back on Exchange with Mr. Johnson, and back to the callers on 790-0991. Yes, you're on Exchange.
Good morning, Mr. Johnson.
Good morning, sir.
I wish you lots of chance in your leadership race.
Thank you.
And I would like to have your opinion. A couple of years ago, if you remember, you ran a survey in Westmount about, there were 6 points, and one of the points were who creates most of the deficits, federal or provincial government. And the survey was done also in a radio station of Montreal, and the majority of the answers were that the federal government is the culprit of the government deficits. What do you think of it now?
Well, we know what our deficit is, at a level of approximately $31 billion at the federal level.
Are you trying to bring it down?
Well, we have to try and bring it down, and we could discuss that this morning as to how we should go about doing that. The provinces are also running deficits, and you must bear in mind that a very large proportion of the federal government's funding is transferred to the provinces, so that in effect we do in that way, absorb deficits, which we keep the deficit but give others the money. But we have to get that deficit under control.
Do you believe that increasing deficits reduce unemployment?
Well, no. You see, the problem the pragmatic problem, without any theology or ideology, is that we are now paying so much out in debt service costs that it restricts the ability of the government to maneuver and do other things which presumably could create employment. That's one of the problems. Is it simply means that you're spending nearly or a good portion of your incremental public revenues on debt service.
Yes, and we didn't have any of these deficits in 50s and 60s, but our unemployment rate was about 3%. Is it right?
Well, I can't recall specifically what our unemployment rate was, but it was, of course, much lower than it is today.
But
in the early 70s, sir, about half of the industrialized countries were running surpluses, including Canada. Today, there's not one that's running a surplus. All of the industrialized countries are in deficit. They've all got these structural deficits built into their systems, and we have to get them under control.
Okay, sir. Thank you for calling. I have to move along. Perhaps a quick couple of suggestions as to how that deficit can be substantially lowered.
From me? Well,
yeah.
Yes. Well, the I can't see cutting any of the social programs at the moment.
All right.
That's one way to reduce costs. I can see trying to make government more efficient, but we federally spend $14 billion out of $98 billion on our actual operations. So even if we were able to save 10 or 20%, it's not going to bring the deficit down substantially.
Right.
But that should be done.
All right.
So therefore, you say if you can't cut, do you tax? Well, I think that we now have a recovery which is underway, and I don't think this is the time, because the recovery is not sufficiently strong, to add a tax burden to Canadians. My feeling is that what we have to do is keep the government lean, to try and reduce as much as we can through our own savings, but not in the area of the social programs or the other support programs. That we then effectively have to get the economy growing and reduce the deficit through growth, because with growth, of course, we get expanded public sector revenues. And that is the way I think we have to move at the moment.
Okay, back to the callers with Don Johnson, 7900991. Just about 35 minutes left. You're on Exchange.
Hello, Mr. Minister.
Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Minister. First off, let me wish you the best of luck in your campaign.
Well, thank you very much.
And the other thing is let me compliment you on your time spent already in the cabinet. You've been one of the best ministers there. But basically the question I'd like to pose is the one dealing with production in Canada. Because even if you do become Prime Minister of this country, how are you going to deal with the fact that over 10% of your working population is unemployed? And basically, why is Canada a nation in the forefront of the industrialized world? Why are we basically lagging, I think, somewhere around the 10th in terms of real production?
Well, our lag is in the increase in productivity. We are still one of the most productive countries in the world in absolute terms, but our rate of productivity increase, you're quite right in identifying, it's been almost flat. It's increasing at the present time, but it was flat for about 7 years, from 1974 to 1981. That's a real problem, and that involves us, I think, in moving quickly ahead with the new technologies, in modernizing our traditional sectors, and hopefully in that fashion improving our productivity. But the jobs that you speak of are going to have to come, I believe, from the entrepreneurial sector, from the small and medium-sized businesses, and that's where much of the economic thrust of economic policy, in my case, that's where it would go, because that is where jobs are being created. The Fortune 500, the largest companies in Fortune magazine, have lost 3 million jobs in the last 3 years. That's from making themselves more productive through modernization, new technologies.
This sort of leads to my second question. I quite agree with your stance in that position, but I'm the director of a small operation that's been around for 4 years right now. I've got 5 employees now and a partner, and my partner is basically the banks. And the banks are slamming me for over 10%, well, definitely over 13%, shall we say, on every dollar I borrow, and it's a cash-intensive business. So I can't hire people. I've just got to keep on paying the banks. So basically, how come the Liberal government over the past 15 years went and tied the value of the Canadian dollar, say, to the American economy? So basically, interest rates go up and down like a roller coaster, and bringing us along with it.
Some people say you have a high interest rate policy. Well, we don't. We live in an international capital market, and in the absence of putting in foreign exchange controls, which I think would have a very adverse impact on our economy, we really have to recognize that capital flows will be governed by the best rate of return. And European currencies have suffered a great deal more than our own, as you know, because of the attraction of investing in the United States, where real interest rates have been so high. But I hope that in the case of small businesses such as you describe your own as being, that we'll be able to improve the fiscal system to attract more equity into that sector, and hence reduce the debt overload that is so difficult for so many small businesses.
Okay, sir. Thank you for calling Exchange. Mr. Munro, one of your candidates, colleagues in the leadership race, has been taking pretty severe shots at the banks. Are the banks, in your opinion, one of the villains in the piece here?
The banks are easy targets. The issue really is not what are bank profits at any particular point in time, but they have to be looked at over a period of time, and you have to determine what they've been doing with their money. I do think that the bank's attitudes have improved during this recession. I think they're recognizing that their clientele can't go bankrupt, that their clients have to be serviced. They simply can't foreclose on small businesses and farmers all over the country the way they might have in the good times, and I think that's been positive. I think the banks are more responsible, more sensitive, I should say, today than they were 2 years ago.
Okay, back to the callers. You're on Exchange.
Well, I don't have a question for Mr. Johnson because I would have no confidence in his answers. But what sort of diverts me is, whatever made him think that he had the qualities to run against Jean Chrétien in a political race like this? It really is, he's chasing moonbeams. Now, the other thing is, the only reason he went public on the fact that he was not using his Air Canada pass, to politicize, was because he could afford not to do so, I'm afraid. And, God save us from Don Johnson.
Well, I was asked whether I was using my Air Canada pass. I didn't go public on it, and I gave the answer that I wasn't. We're met by reporters outside the House of Commons. And if I'm supposed to expand...
I'm one of your constituents, by the way.
Oh, good.
Westman.
Good. Well, I mean, that's the simple answer. On the Air Canada pass, I was asked outside the House of Commons if I was using it. I wasn't using it, and I told them that.
I see. So where do you get the money to pay your fare on it when you fly then?
Well, we have a campaign fund. We're trying to raise money, as every candidate is. This is a very expensive business, and we feel that the travel costs of the campaign should be paid out of the campaign funds.
On but the rich can afford it.
Well, it isn't a question of the rich. It's a question of the people who contribute to your campaign. And
not rich?
Pardon me?
You are not rich?
I'm personally not rich. I certainly couldn't afford to support a campaign of this kind, and I doubt if any of the other candidates could either.
Okay, sir.
Right.
Thank you for calling. You're on Exchange.
Yes, Mr. Johnson. I wonder if you are aware, really, of what is going on here in Montreal pertaining to the federal government's language policy. For instance, I'll give you a little example and then I'll quote my own case. There's been about 35, 40 people fired this last 4 or 5 months in small jobs on an outside agency for the federal government because they were not bilingual. Now, my own case, I've worked for immigration for 6 years in an outside agency for 5 security companies. And I had no problem whatever. I speak some French and some Spanish and everything. The federal government moved in a few months ago. Everyone had to be bilingual, even though there's very few English or French-speaking people moving through this detention center. It's a detention center for illegal immigrants. And on my team alone, 10 of us just laid off just like that. Actually, we quit. We walked out because we wouldn't take the test because they're giving this B test, which is a very highly sophisticated test rather than the A test, which is legal. On my team, there was 9 French Canadians and myself. I was the only English-speaking guy on the team. One guy spoke fluently Spanish and French, and he's gone. And even Quebec wouldn't allow that, but the federal government is certainly doing it.
Okay, sir. Perhaps Mr. Johnson could address himself to that.
Well, I'm not quite sure of the circumstances. We're talking about an outside agency or an actual agency of the government, and the gentleman referred to a chap who spoke Spanish and French fluently, who also had gone, and that suggests to me that there must be something more here than a language issue.
I would think so, because some of the people that were actually fired or quit their job because of it can speak better French and English. They're more bilingual than some of the immigration officers looking after this affair.
So is this a language question, or is it some other problem?
There's other problems, but the main one is the language question. And I've been in touch with Mr. Roberts and Mr. Hal Herbert, my federal MP, as last January, and I've just got a bunch of stuff gone to Mr. Roberts today on it, but I can't get any clear answer. The only thing I know, there's been about 35, 40 people fired out of their jobs. Well, the ones that quit
knew they wouldn't pass the test because of the failure rate. They can't even get unemployment insurance.
Are these immigration people, sir?
Yes, we're looking after the illegal immigration center.
But are they public sector employees? Are they employees of the federal government?
No, the ones that look after are a security agency.
So it's the security agency which laid them off. Is that correct?
Actually, yes, forced onto them by the federal government. The federal government moved in and said everybody's got to be bilingual. But there's several of us there that have been there for over 6 years, and no problem whatever until these last couple of months. And the whole gang is cleaned out. These last few months, there's been over 40 people have lost their jobs over it.
Well, I'm glad you've written to Mr. Roberts and taken it up with Hal Herbert. The situation is a bit complicated, I think, to go into here this morning, because there seems to be more to this than just the language issue, and it's an outside agency. So let's see if we can follow it up through Mr. Roberts' department and find out what's going on.
And if there is a language problem...
I've seen the contract between the security agent and the federal government, and it stated that you had to be bilingual. But when we were hired by these security agencies, that was never mentioned. You signed there, you could speak English, or a few words of French, and that was it.
Another area you might explore, sir, on this question would be the Office of the Official Languages Commissioner, Mr. Max Yalden, and he has an office in Montreal, and you might call them as well as going through the other suggestions that Mr. Johnson made. Thank you for calling Exchange. Right back after this short break. Back on Exchange with Donald Johnson, Liberal leadership candidate, the only one from Montreal. You're on Exchange.
Good morning, Mr. Johnson.
Good morning, sir.
Yeah, I don't know what your motives are in running for the leadership of the Liberal Party, but what I would say is that I would hope that a lot of common sense and prudence would be exercised in choosing the leadership of the Liberal Party, because if John Turner is not selected as the leader of the party, there's no way that the Liberal Party would form the next government.
Well, that's an opinion, and and I respect your opinion. I don't happen to share it, or else I wouldn't be in the race. And I have many motives for running for this. I think that I have a vision of the country several years hence, which I've been trying to put before the Canadian people and before the delegates during this campaign. I think I have the experience in major portfolios and in private life that enabled me to pursue that vision with strategies and policies, which I think have to be discussed, whether I win it or not. I think there are issues that have to be dealt with and that should be debated during this leadership campaign. And in the absence of a good race, I don't see that happening.
Okay, sir. You're on Exchange.
Yes. Hello, Mr. Johnson.
Good morning.
First of all, I'm an admirer of yours. I've followed your policies, and I think that you were the only one that's stressing the technological advances and how, and that we must deal with them. Now, first of all, then, I would like to talk about small and medium-sized businesses and the banks, because I feel that, and I wonder whether you would agree with me, that the banks have been really rather ruinous to small and medium-sized businesses the last few years. And I can't see how any business community, small or big or medium or whatever, can pay high interest rates like we were faced with. 23% interest taking out of the business. You're just driving them to the wall. And plus that, the banks would say, as an instance I know about personally, that the bank would say, the person had to spend 15 minutes a day looking after the account, and they said, well, okay, that's $10,000 more, but we have to spend 15 minutes.
Okay, perhaps Mr. Johnson could address himself to the matter of the banks and small business.
Well, the bank's defense, of course, is that they have to borrow money and pay the going rate, and they only get the same margin. So whether interest rates are at 9% or whether they're 20%, their profit margins should be roughly the same. Sometimes their profit margins look larger because they're borrowing in a period when interest rates are rising, so much of their money is borrowed at a lower rate, and then when interest rates fall, as you saw happen last year, course, their profit margins are squeezed. But as I said earlier, I think the banks are more sensitive today to the problems of small business than they've been in the past. My own view is that we have to correct that situation by getting more equity into small business and getting a lot of the debt off the balance sheets of these small businesses.
Yes, but right now, wouldn't you say this business of promoting small and medium-sized businesses, that it certainly seems to be a paradox? They are the ones that create the jobs, and they are the ones that get forced out of business.
Indeed, they do create the jobs, and thank goodness many of them don't get forced out of business. They've been the great salvation of this country, and in fact in the United States as well during the recession, because they have been creating jobs, whereas large businesses have been losing jobs. And I see that trend very much continuing, and I think we need a set of policies to encourage it and stimulate it.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you for calling Exchange. You're on Exchange.
I'd like to ask Mr. Johnson about his guaranteed universal income plan. And possibly to explain his plan, if he could answer 4 questions I have about it.
Go ahead, sir.
Go ahead.
Mr. Johnson, there's a possibility that the provinces might object to your plan because they would feel it would be a provincial intrusion constitutionally. How would you handle provincial objections?
Well, we have to get our act together federally and provincially. We have one clientele, as I think I was saying earlier, and the provinces early in the 1970s recognized there had to be some rationalization of all these various support schemes, and clearly we have to have the provinces on side.
Thank you. Second question. May I ask how the payments would be made? Would they be universal? Would everybody getting them, or would there be some kind of means-related test first before payments were made?
No, I believe that we're capable today, with the database that we have and the techniques that, in fact, that the new technologies have brought to us, to administer it through the fiscal system as a negative income tax, much in the manner of the current child tax credit. And it would mean bringing all the existing programs together, whether it be unemployment insurance, Canadian assistance plan payments, family allowance, and so on. But I'm not suggesting that we would look at the old age security sector or GIS or, of course, Medicare.
Thank you. My third question, what income level would you set for the payments, and how would the income level be decided in the future?
First of all, as a fundamental principle, because we have a deficit and we can't simply increase it in order to satisfy a very expensive income security plan, we have to do it within the existing levels of income support, which are between $30 and $35 billion per year between the federal and the provincial governments. So in other words, the existing framework is what is going to enable us to establish the levels. And they will be adjusted depending upon the income of the individual. Of course, there is other income of the individual. The plan also has to have incentives built into it so that it does not discourage people from getting into the workplace. And I have simply put this forward as a concept. I believe the time has come to re-examine it as we did in the early 1970s. In the early 1970s, we were not successful in bringing that about. I think today that we should be successful in bringing it about, because we are in a new world, as it were, emerging from the session of 1982 and 1983.
You had another question, sir?
Yes, I'd like to ask you about possible additional payments. Earlier on, when speaking to Mr. McKenty, you mentioned continuation of the old age security payments and the guaranteed income supplement. I can see a possibility for continuing the guaranteed income supplement, but wouldn't the old age security payment be superfluous with a guaranteed universal income?
It would depend upon who received the payment. You can do this in so many ways, sir. It's it requires a lot of creative thinking to come up with the best formula. There are many pilot projects that have been tried in various parts of the world, and it's not an easy matter to address. But I think that logic tells us that we have such a confusion of programs now that we've got to find a better way of delivering that basic income support to those most in need. And I believe that can be done. And I'm simply saying that those that are in receipt of OAS and GIS would not be the recipients of the guaranteed annual income, as you call it, or benefit from the negative tax credit that I'm suggesting.
Okay, sir. Thank you for some interesting questions. We just about have 15 minutes left with Donald Johnson, Liberal leadership candidate. Your questions, comments on the Liberal leadership race and how it's developing and what you would expect from Mr. Johnson. 7900991. Yes, you're on Exchange.
Good morning, Mr. Johnson.
Good morning.
Mr. Johnson, in 1980, when the referendum in Quebec came up, I was made pretty well aware of Mr. Trudeau's part, particularly in his Quebec speech, and Mr. Chrétien's part in coming back to Quebec and promoting federalism to the extent that they did, and ensuring sort of the defeat of this referendum proposal by the PQ. Now, I ask you this question really out of sheer ignorance, but could you please tell me at that time what part you yourself played in trying to promote federalism or separation or proposed separation of...
Well, we all, I think, played a very active part. The attention obviously focused particularly on Mr. Trudeau, and of course Mr. Chrétien was the lieutenant for that federal thrust and campaigned actively, you may recall, with Mr. Claude Ryan, in fact appearing on the same platform night after night. The rest of us participated in rallies and speaking engagements and so on here and there around the province.
I see. And if you were the future Prime Minister, you would, I take it, do exactly what Mr. Trudeau has done, or did in 1980, if you thought that this was at stake, this issue was a problem again.
Well, if that issue becomes a problem again, you can be sure that every politician at the federal level will be there, certainly in the Liberal Party. I'm hopeful that we've buried that beast. I know the Parti Québécois keep raising it as going to form part of their next election platform, but I don't think that's the disposition of the people of this province. I think that when the time comes, they will be wise enough not to campaign on the strength of an independence option.
Well, that's fine, sir. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you for calling. Do you share some of the criticism of Mr. Turner that he, in fact, did not play any role in the salvation of federal Canada at the time of the referendum?
I have never criticized Mr. Turner on that ground. He was in private life and not even indicate any intention of coming back to public life. I mean, those of us who are in public life obviously and are front and center in this, and together with all the people in this province who were so active during that period, I think played a very important role. But I don't think it's something that we should criticize other Canadians on who didn't even live in the province of Quebec. Okay, back with Mr. Johnson for a final 14 minutes after this short break. Back on Exchange, I'd like to take as many of your questions as we could with Mr. Johnson in the last 10 or 12 minutes. You're on Exchange.
Good morning, Mr. Johnson.
Good morning, sir.
I'm pleased to have the opportunity to wish you good luck in the realization of your economic objectives for our beloved Canada, and especially as it relates to the need to correct the dismal performance of our manufacturing industry in Canada. I believe OECD studies indicate that on a per capita basis, manufacturing activity in Canada is the lowest amongst all developed countries. Now, the reason for this dismal state of affairs was suggested by Mr. Kierans, whose latest book was reviewed in last Saturday's Gazette. Has to do with the irresponsibility on the part of Canadians not to invest in their own private manufacturing industry, and also the irresponsibility of our government leaders in the past not to encourage Canadians to take their money out of their insurance policies and then their bank accounts and invest in common stock. And as a result, because of this irresponsibility, we let the foreigners do it for us, and as a consequence, Canada has developed into a state of just exporting raw materials. Mr. Kierans also suggested that it was rather naive to suggest that we can quickly go into an advanced technological state of our manufacturing industry, but we should move into it rather slowly, because we still have much more greater opportunity to, for example, start making aluminum ladders instead of just exporting aluminum ingots out of the country. Could you, as far as I know, I have not heard you speak about this particular subject about foreign control of the economy, and perhaps you could offer some of your comments on it now.
Indeed, I I'm a great believer in trying to encourage Canadians to invest in their economy. I believe in the carrot principle rather than the stick. And I have some ideas with respect to the fiscal system, which I would hope would encourage Canadians to do that. For example, I think we should have a hard look at the capital gains tax, not with a view to eliminating it, but with a view to increasing the so-called rollover provisions so that Canadians can invest in the economy, can sell, can reinvest, can sell, can reinvest, and they will only pay tax either when they die or when they cash in their chips. And in that manner, it becomes really a tax on consumption rather than savings. I think that would be very useful. And in addition to that, I would extend that to Canadians who hold assets abroad. In other words, tell them if they sell their assets abroad and bring their money back to Canada and reinvest it, they won't be taxed until such time as they, as I say, cash in their chips or die. I think that would be a great incentive to the entrepreneurial sector, and I think it would be a great incentive for people to invest in Canadian companies.
Okay, sir. Thank you for an interesting question. You're on Exchange.
Yes, so what's your opinion on the Ministry of Multiculturalism being established?
I have been, in my travels across Canada, I must say that I've been very impressed by the tremendous contribution that the ethnic communities make to the mosaic of Canada. Whether you're in the Vesna Festival in Saskatoon or the other Ukrainian festivals out west, or the other Italian communities, the Greek communities, and the Native communities in Canada, I found it to be a very rich and rewarding experience. And I must say that I think that we have been wise to support these multicultural activities. I think that.
What about that they're recommending now that there should be a regular department on this, and that it shouldn't be, put aside as a second or third class citizenship, and that the CBC, when is the CBC going to respect this thing? They're always talking about English Canada and French Canada as if, everybody's English in the rest of Canada, which is a big lie.
Well, I don't think it's intended as a lie, but you're quite correct.
It doesn't recognize the 60% of the population that is neither French or English in the rest of Canada.
Well, of course, that's why we have, as you know, a Ministry of Multiculturalism. And
I know, but why isn't the CBC interpreting this? Why is the CBC doing such a bad job?
Well, the CRTC has licensed multilingual stations, as you know. We have one in Montreal.
I know, but that took 5 years before Juno would even reply to a letter of, establishing that station. He stalled it for 5 years by not even replying to a request to start this.
What is it you would like Mr. Johnson to do if he were Prime Minister?
Well, I think we have a very good example here in Quebec, and I think we should praise for once the Quebec government. We have the Planète series on Radio Quebec that the 20 ethnic groups in Quebec can interpret themselves to the rest of the population, and this way integrate with the rest of the population, have the rest of the population know about them. Not that some Englishman or Frenchman is interpreting them to the rest of the country.
Well, that may be a very fair comment. I would hope to see more Canadians come into contact with the very rich cultural heritage of so many of our ethnic communities. That's been a privilege I've had now as a member of the government, which I must say I did not appreciate as much in the past as I do today.
Okay, sir. You're on Exchange.
Mr. Johnson?
Yes, sir.
I wish you well in your leadership campaign.
Thank you very much.
And if you went on to win the campaign and form the next government, I would like to know what you would do about the dismal low percentage of Anglos in the federal service here in Quebec, compared to Ontario, where it's 27% Francophones, and it's about 2% Anglophones here in the federal government.
I know, and I'm concerned about that, and was when I was president of the Treasury Board, and I hope that steps are now being taken through the Treasury Board, which I'm no longer responsible for increasing those percentages very substantially. I'd like to see much higher Anglophone representation in the federal service in the province of Quebec, and also, for that matter, in the civil service in Quebec City itself. I think we should have proportional representation there as well.
Okay, sir. Thank you for calling. You're on Exchange.
Mr. Johnson?
Yes, sir.
Personal interest do you have in Canadian banks? Do you have any investment in them?
I have no investments in Canadian banks. In fact, any investments I have are held in trust in any event, and I've never invested in bank stock in private life, and I would be surprised if any of the trustees that we're required to have as members of the cabinet are investing in bank stocks, but I just don't know. I can't say because they're all blind trusts.
But one more question. There's a very strong rumor that the Canadian banks are helping to finance big deals with multinationals. Are making big deals with dictators in Latin America, for example, and people are being dispossessed of their property. Now, what would you have to say about that?
Well, I must say you're catching me a little short on facts in that regard, sir. I'm not aware of what involvement specifically the Canadian banking community has in supporting, as you call them, dictatorial regimes. I'm not aware of that. The banks internationally, obviously in Canada, are very strong. They're amongst the largest banks in the world, and some of them derive a substantial amount of their revenues from international transactions, but I've never imputed any political motives to them in any way.
Okay, sir. Thank you for calling Exchange. We still have time for a number of calls before noon, 790-0991. Yes, you're on Exchange with Mr. Johnson.
Good morning, Mr. Johnson.
Good morning, sir.
I have 34 years experience in North America. I would like to ask your opinion. Am I right in my experience that every time, every 8 years or 5 years, there's a change in government? Would you agree with me? Sort of people want change.
Well, there hasn't been a lot of change with certain governments, which the changes have occurred more in other countries than in Canada. Liberal government has had a very substantial presence at the federal level throughout, in fact, much of this century. The provincial government in Ontario, I think, has an unparalleled record. That's the Conservative government amongst Western democracies.
Now, Mr. Johnson, if I was your political advisor, I would suggest you save your money what you spend on this election, put it in very well terms, make money with it, and run the next time when the Conservative gets in, because I can almost bet on it against 10 against $1 that the next government gonna be either minority or majority. It will be Conservative. But the next time you would run, definitely you would get the election. You would win it.
Sir, Mr. Johnson, we always get all kinds of free, perceptive advice on this program. How do you respond to that gentleman's advice?
Well,
that the real time to run is not this time, but the next time.
Well, I think the democratic process is such that, we need people running. I think we keep the process alive. I think we keep ideas out in front of the public. I think this campaign is great for the Liberal Party and hence great for the country because the two-party system, or three parties as we have, I think is fundamental to maintaining our democratic institutions. So I would not ever back off from a fight simply because I thought that I was an underdog in it. And that's the attitude I have here. I'm in it, and I'm going to put up as good a show as I can, and I hope to win it. If I don't, I still think it's good for the process.
Now, if you don't win it, what are your plans with regard to the next federal election?
Well, I expect to run in the next federal election. I've never planned on spending a long career in politics. As I've said many times, I think it's good for the system to get people into politics and out of politics. And in fact, I've also said during this campaign, the only way we're going to get good representation from women in the House of Commons is to open up more seats for them. 50% of the seats should be occupied by women, and if people stay in there too long, obviously you block the progression of women through the system and young people with energy and new ideas. So,
speaking of seats, yes. Mr. Mulrooney was in the seat that you are now occupying about a week ago, and he said there is not a safe Liberal seat in Quebec, and I noticed that the Conservative membership in your riding has gone from 100 to 1,500. Are you concerned that you might not win St. Henry Westmount in the next federal election?
I never take anything for granted in politics, and I intend to fight the next election as I fought the last one on the basis that you can never be overconfident in politics. I'm glad to see the Conservative increasing their membership. That means that more people are getting politically active. I suspect that's because of the nomination convention that's coming up.
Okay, we want to thank you, Mr. Johnson, for being our guest in exchange. Mr. Donald Johnson, the Liberal leadership candidate from Montreal, member for St. Henri Westmount, Minister of Science and Technology. And I want to thank all our callers for participating in this hour with Mr. Johnson. I hope you'll stay tuned for Gord Sinclair in the News, followed by the Joe Cannon Show. Joe will be talking with the Minister of Transport, Mr. Lloyd Axworthy, and with model Chantal Gagnon, and Melanie King and Joe Cannon will be talking about safety in the skies. I hope you'll join me tomorrow at 10:05. Neil McKenty for Exchange.